I want to start out showing you a picture that ties into the sermon for today. Put some ideas in your mind. These are terraces built on the mountains down in Peru, Monte Picchu, the Incan ruins, and what I want you to pay attention to is that each terrace is like a stair step, but they're like 30 foot high. So I just want you to think about this for a minute. If you're standing on, say, the low terrace, you're standing right about here, you can see everything that's down below you. You can see everything that's on the same level with you. But what you absolutely, positively can't see is what's just above you. And if somebody is 3 levels higher, they've climbed 3 levels higher, they might be describing things that make no sense whatsoever, because they can see where they are, but they can also see where they've been. And that's a good parable for the way spiritual growth works. All of us are works in progress. We're all growing one step at a time. One of my favorite old hymns is called Higher Ground, and it goes like this: I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I onward bound, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. And I'm a long way from where I want to be, but I've also come a long way from where I used to be. There was a time in my life, when I was 18 or 19, where I got into a bad habit of illegal dumping. I mean, I was bad about illegal dumping, and I wasn't, it's not like I was a litter bug, just throwing stuff out the window, but I was working at my grandmother's place once, cleaning out an old shed for her, and just had a big truckload full of junk. And I was thinking, well, where do I take this? And I said, well, I'll take it to the dump. But the dump wasn't an official dump. It was not a landfill. It was just this area down by the railroad track where everybody in the community took their trash and dumped it out. And in my mind, well, that's what that place is for. So that's what I'm going to do. And I drove there and got out. I was starting to unload my trash right there with all the other piles of trash. And this man came driving up. And he had a very stern look on his face, and he said, I want you to know this is my land. And I paid money for this land, and people keep trashing it. And he said, I want you to load that stuff back up and take it away from here. And I said, yes, sir. I'm sure sorry. He got in his truck and drove off. As soon as he drove off and he was gone, I quickly raked it all off and took off. And here's the thing. Just left it there. And then I went back and got a second load of junk, and I decided I won't go there. I'll take it to the landfill. Well, I got to the landfill. I'm 18 or 19 now. Got to the landfill, and would you believe they were closed? And they had this gate, this bar gate, blocking the road going in there. I thought, here I've done the right thing. I'll come to the landfill, and they can't even be open. So what do you think I did? Dumped it right there by the gate. Now I told you it was bad. Here's what I want you to know. I have so drastically changed from that I'm like the opposite extreme now. Every time Melina and I go for a walk, we walk on a Forest Service road behind our house, I take a trash bag with me and pick up other people's trash. And I mean, I come back with I keep that road clean. I keep it spick and span. I have an eye for trash. I can spot a can. I can spot a plastic bottle. And when I get home with them, not only do I not dump them, I recycle them. I take them to recycling. But there was a time when I was on this level where I couldn't see anything wrong with what I was doing. It's just what you do. But as we grow, we climb higher, we have a clearer, fuller perspective on the world around us, on other people. Like back then, it had never crossed my mind that that's somebody's land. I had no concept of property, land ownership. It was just land. It was just a dump. But I saw no problem with something that now you couldn't pay me to do. And the only good thing I can say about that is that thank God for growth. Thank God that as we grow, we see things about ourselves that at one earlier point we just could not see. I just didn't have the understanding. Well, I want to show you two Bible characters this morning who dumped a lot on each other, and they wound up dumping quite a bit on other people too. Their stories are found in the book of 1 Samuel, the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel. And the two people I'm wanting us to look at today are Samuel the prophet Samuel, and King Saul. King Saul, the very first king of Israel. If you know much about Old Testament, you know much about the history of the Hebrew people, you probably know that Samuel, the prophet Samuel, was a highly respected leader. People just really did not question Samuel about much of anything. It had to get pretty bad before they would question Samuel. And Samuel had a whole lot going for him. He managed to hear from God during a time when not very many people were. He had this genuine connection with God. He was gifted. He could see the future. He was the real thing. Saul, on the other hand, the more you know about Saul, probably the less you think of him. He was a failure as a king. Saul eventually got so threatened by David that he was overtaken by a spirit of jealousy, and he just embarrassed himself. And Saul, instead of climbing up the steps, he actually regressed. Now, that's the way I characterize those two men. But what I want to show you is that we got one who's generally speaking a very good role model. We got another one, Saul, who's a good example only of what not to do. That's basically what Saul was. But here's what I've begun realizing. It goes back to something Miss Wilma Talaferra said 3 or 4 years ago. Before she died, she said, Lance, there's enough bad in the best of us, and there's enough good in the worst of us, that all of us ought to be a little more patient with everybody else, with all of us. And there was some bad even in the prophet Samuel. And there was some good even in the prophet Saul. Even in King Saul. He didn't always blow it. Even Saul had a good day every now and then. And Samuel had some bad days, and Samuel had some blind spots that he was not willing to look at. And I want to give you an example, first of all, of Samuel. Something in his own family that he just couldn't deal with or wouldn't deal with. All I know for sure is he did not deal with it. This is chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, verse 1, 2, and 3. As Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel. Joel and Abijah, his oldest sons, held court in Beersheba. But they were not like their father, for they were greedy for money. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. Not like their father, greedy, accepted bribes, perverted justice. And yet the people had to come to Samuel and say, look, you got to do something about them. You can't let your sons be judges, rulers over us, because they're not like you. You got a couple of rotten eggs there, Samuel. Well, Samuel took that well, of course, don't you imagine? How do you feel when somebody says something about your children? Even if you know it's true, don't you hate hearing somebody else say it? Don't you wish they would just hush about it and leave it alone? Well, that was the attitude Samuel had. He realized that he was going to have to do something about those sons. But my point is, those sons had been crooked and corrupt for some time, and Samuel had not done anything about it. It had to get so bad, they had to start causing so much trouble that people came to Samuel and said, hey, you got to do something. Well, let me say this while we're on the subject of our children. One reason we're sensitive about our children, and one reason it's sometimes hard to see our children as they are, is that parents tend to take too much credit when the children turn out well. And parents also tend to take on too much blame when they don't turn out well. Truth is, parents, you are the biggest early influence in your child's life. Don't ever underestimate the importance of that, the power in that. But you're not the only influence in your kid's life. You're not the only influence. And Samuel took this personally because apparently he did something very common. He tended to take credit if they did well. He felt blame. He felt personally insulted if his boys turned out bad. Well, Samuel proceeded with the process of replacing his sons. He arranged to find a new king. He and God worked together on this. God led him to a new leader whose name was Saul. And Saul was a man who had a whole lot of natural ability going for him. He was a tall man. He stood head and shoulders above all the average sized men. He was a strong man. a good military tactician. But Saul had this terrible inferiority complex that just kept ruining his life, and he never dealt with it. In fact, it led to his ultimate downfall. So here's what you got. You got two men here. You got Samuel, who really wants to believe he's better than he really is, who is so high on himself that he can't see his dark sides. He can't acknowledge when one of his plans is not going well. That's hard for him. Hard to admit when he's wrong. But then you got Saul, on the other hand, he's terribly down on himself. He needs to believe in himself. The people around him need for him to believe in himself. But he just didn't. Somehow or another, a lot of us have gotten Christian humility and self-deprecation mixed up. And it's almost as if we think that I'm being humble by telling everybody how unworthy I am, how slow I am, how bad I am, how weak I am. And you've heard me mention before, the person who just cannot accept a compliment, you can't force feed them a compliment. They're always going to play it down. And sadly, in their minds, because I've been there, they're often thinking, well, I'm just being humble. Well, being humble is like the word modesty I talked about in the beginning. Modesty, humility means you take a correct measure of yourself. Neither Saul nor Samuel did that. Samuel thought he was above everybody else, better than everybody else. Samuel thought that. Saul saw himself as lower, inferior. And the problem with that is that people needed Saul to believe in Saul. And the truth is, nobody was going to believe in Saul if he didn't believe in himself. I want to show you what happened when Saul was about to be anointed, publicly proclaimed king. This is chapter 10 of 1 Samuel. Chapter 10, I want to read some key verses here to summarize the story. Verse 6, first of all. At that time, the Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you, and you will prophesy with them. Verse 9, as Saul turned to leave, God gave him a new heart. All Samuel's signs were fulfilled. The Spirit of God came on Saul. He already had some natural abilities, and the Spirit of God came with amazing leadership abilities that we're going to show up a little later. But in spite of that, watch what happened when it came time for him to stand up and be the person everybody needed him to be. When it came time for him to stand up and be who God was calling him to be. This is chapter 10, verse 21 and following. The preceding verse says, Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel before the Lord. The tribe of Benjamin was chosen by lot. They were casting lots, narrowing down who the king was going to be. Then he brought the family of the tribe of Benjamin before the Lord, and the family of the Matrites was chosen. And finally, Saul, son of Kish, was chosen from among them. But when they looked for him, he had disappeared. He had exited the stage. He had gone out the back door, basically. So they asked the Lord, where is he? And the Lord replied, he's hiding among the baggage. He went to where everybody's packs were, stacked up, and he just kind of got down behind them. They found him and brought him out, and he stood head and shoulders above anyone else. Then Samuel said to all the people, this is a man God has chosen as your king. No one in all Israel is like him. People shouted, long live the king. Everybody at that point was excited about Saul. Everybody at that point believed in Saul except for Saul. And that turned out to be his demise. There's a verse down the page from there, chapter 10, verse 27. The same day all of this happened, the Bible says there were some scoundrels who complained, how can this man save us? And they scorned him and refused to bring him gifts. But Saul ignored them. Why did they scorn him? Why did they scoff? Because they could tell, if he's going to lead us, he better know where he's going. If he's going to do this job, he's got to quit hiding in the baggage, and he's got to stand tall. There are people in your life, people in your family, people in your social circles who need desperately for you to stand tall. Stand up to your full height. Embrace who you are, what God has made you, and what God has given you to do. And hiding, dodging, talking about how unworthy we are may be a cheap substitute for humility, but don't let that fool you. It destroys your effectiveness, and you let a lot of other people down when you don't stand up and be who you are. What I see happening with Saul and with Samuel is that both of those men, as their life unfolded, after these events we were talking about, Samuel having the embarrassment over his sons, Saul having the embarrassment of just being Saul, both of those men lost the support of people because one of them thought too highly of himself and one of them thought too lowly of himself. What I'm getting at is it really doesn't matter whether you think too highly of yourself, whether you think too lowly of yourself. Either one is going to hurt you. Either one will wind up hurting other people. People that you're trying to pull out of a dump, you'll wind up dumping on them. Now, another way that Samuel's dark side showed up is that throughout the rest of his life, he became Saul's number one critic. It seemed like every time those two men met, Samuel had something to sass Saul over. Now, true enough, Saul made a lot of mistakes. He did some wrong things. But have you ever been the person or been around the person who will tell you what you're doing wrong? They're honestly going to tell it like it is, but you just get this strange sense that they're enjoying this a little too much. People that get their kicks by being critics, they enjoy it a little too much. And for a long time, I've thought Samuel just got a little carried away. He never said an encouraging word to Saul. He was a critic and not a coach. People need coaches. And a coach is going to point out when a mistake was made, when you didn't do your best. He's going to motivate you to do better. But he's not going to just tear you down and make you feel worthless, because the coach wants you to win. And people who don't believe in themselves don't win, because they don't even try. They don't believe that they can. Well, Saul had a couple of bright moments, and I want you to see how Samuel actually responded when Saul got it right. Remember, even the worst of us get it right sometimes. The dumbest people will say something intelligent now and then. Saul won an amazing victory. This was actually a rescue effort. The situation was that another tribe, the Ammonites, had moved in. They had taken over the land of some of the Israelites, two Israelite tribes. And the king of the Ammonites gouged out the right eye of every Israelite man in the whole region. Gouged out the eye, left them with a left eye. And he put them under severe oppression. You talk about terrorism, gouging out every man's eye. We can do a whole lot worse. This is a taste of what you'll get. Well, 6,000 of those Israelites managed to flee. And they fled to a place called Jabesh Gilead. And once the king of the Ammonites realized that he'd not gotten that some of the men had escaped, well, he had more eye gouging to do. He had more raping and pillaging to do. So he set out with his army to Jabesh Gilead to get the ones who'd gotten away. Saul heard about it. He found out what was happening. This was his very first big moment as king. And he rose up tall. And he did what God had given him to do. Chapter 11, verse 6 and 11. Keep in mind what was going on and why somebody had to do something. Innocent people were being butchered and oppressed, tortured. The Bible says the Spirit of God came powerfully upon Saul, and he became very angry. Did you know that there's a place for anger? Anger is not in itself a bad thing. It's just an emotion. What matters is some things should make us angry and other things shouldn't. The way it worked with Jesus seemed to get angry when somebody else was mistreated, when somebody else was cut short, when somebody else was rejected or left out. That made Jesus angry. And yet Jesus also taught us about turning the other cheek. If you're slapped on one cheek, turn the other. How does that all work? That's a difficult scripture for a lot of people. How can if somebody slaps me, I'm supposed to turn and offer them the other cheek too? Well, it's important to point something out there that'll help you discern when to get angry and when not to get angry. A slap A slap on the face is not like a fist in the nose. A slap is an insult. It was an insult. And to this day, that's an insult. A slap is not going to knock a person out. It's not going to do serious bodily harm. A slap is an insult. Other things are a genuine threat. What we have to learn to do is discern what's a genuine threat and what's just an insult. If something is a genuine threat to you, if you're in some kind of abusive situation, that's not something you just need to keep taking, turning the other cheek so they can knock you silly again. That's a genuine threat. Protect yourself, protect the people you love from genuine threats. But we can grow to the point where insults just don't matter so much. An insult is another person's opinion of us. And I do find that the more we grow, the higher we climb in our spiritual maturity, the less what other people think and say matters. And in fact, an over-obsession with what other people think or what other people are saying is really a sign of spiritual immaturity. As we grow, we start realizing we climb up a little higher and we're able to see the person who said that to me, who said that about me, what they said really says more about them than it does about me. Do you know what I'm talking about? If a person is just negative, they love to complain, those people, every time they open their mouth, they may be talking about somebody else. What they're really doing is demonstrating something about themselves. They're showing how their mind works, how sour their spirit is. As we grow, we start realizing a lot of the insults really say more about that other person. Well, last thing I want to tell you is what Samuel did after Saul's victory. Verse 11, Saul successfully organized a surprise attack on the Ammonites. But before dawn the next morning, Saul arrived, having divided his army into 3 detachments. He launched a surprise attack against the Ammonites and slaughtered them the whole morning. The remnant of their army was so badly scattered that no 2 of them were left together. Some of you who military people would appreciate this, especially. I've gathered that it takes a lot of tactical planning and a lot of military smarts to organize a surprise attack that involves hundreds of men who aren't very well trained. It's a militia army. These are farmers who've taken up swords to protect. Saul managed to lead this, to organize this attack in the dark, everybody in place, and it worked wonderfully. That shows Saul had something going. But guess what Samuel did right after that attack, that victory? Saul's first big victory. Guess what Samuel did? He announced his retirement. Because some people, if we can't be the star, we just don't want to play. I would like for you to look for yourself in these 2 Bible characters. The book of Hebrews says all these things happen to them for our examples. chances are your personality leans toward one or the other. You're a little overconfident sometimes, we'll say. A little too high on yourself and defensive. Or maybe you're more of a Saul. And it's time for you to stand up and be and do what you're here to do.